I didn't plan to propose to Thierry Moreau. I planned to leave quietly, the way I always did. But then I watched my fiancé's thumb trace a slow circle at my sister's waist, and something in me went very, very still. Not her shoulder, her back. Low and familiar. The way you touch someone you have been imagining touching for a very long time. Camille did not move away. I set my glass down on the nearest surface, a marble console table along the wall, and I watched them for exactly 4 seconds. Long enough to be certain, short enough that no one else caught me watching. Then I smoothed the front of my dress, turned toward the window, and looked out at the Maro estate gardens lit gold in the October evening, and I made myself breathe. The engagement dinner had been Edouard's idea. A proper celebration, he'd said. Both families together. And which had sounded like sentiment when he said it 2 weeks ago, and sounded like theater now, watching my fiancé's fingers curl possessively against my younger sister's waist, while his mother asked me about the Côte d'Azur property restoration he had arranged for me to consult on. Consolation prize, I thought. And somehow I hadn't seen it until this exact moment. I had spent 3 years being the sensible one, the reliable one, the woman Edouard Moreau could bring to a board dinner without embarrassment, who understood his family's social architecture, who worked brilliantly in the background of beautiful things without ever demanding to be one of them. We had been, in every measurable way, well matched. What I had failed to measure was whether well matched was the same as chosen. You see it too. The voice came from directly behind me, a low, unhurried, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to fill a room because the room rearranged itself around it. I did not turn immediately. That was instinct. The instinct of someone who has spent years learning that composure is the only currency that reliably holds its value. "I'm sorry," I said to the window. "You're not." A pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. "You've been watching them for 40 seconds. You set your glass down before you turned, which means you decided you needed both hands free. And you haven't moved because you're calculating, not because you're hurt." Now I turned. Thierry Moreau was standing close enough that I had to adjust my angle to look up at him, which I resented immediately. He was taller than his brother by several inches, and broader in a way that had nothing to do with bulk, and everything to do with how much space he occupied simply by existing in it. The kind of face that gave nothing away and somehow communicated everything, composed the way old buildings are composed, with structural intention underneath every surface. His eyes were a specific shade of gray-green that I catalogued without meaning to, the same way I catalogued load-bearing walls and hidden inconsistencies, because something about them suggested depth under pressure and a long history of holding weight. He was watching me the way I had been watching Edouard and my sister, clinically, completely. "I'm calculating," I agreed. "And yes, I see it." Something shifted in his expression, not warmth, not quite, but the specific adjustment of a man who expected to startle someone and found that he hadn't. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About them, I'm not sure I did know, consciously." I glanced back toward the room. Camille had shifted slightly. Edouard's hand had dropped, the performance of propriety resuming now that there were eyes. I think I chose not to look. "That's different from not knowing." "Yes," I said. "It is." He said nothing for a moment. The silence between us was not comfortable. It was a different kind of silence, pressurized, attentive, the kind that asks something of you without specifying what. Across the room, Edouard caught my eye and smiled. That easy, practiced smile I had once found charming and now recognized as the expression of a man who had never had to work very hard for anything he wanted. And he started toward me. I don't know exactly what happened in the 3 seconds between watching Edouard move and hearing the words leave my mouth. I know it was not impulsive in the way people later assumed. It was the opposite of impulsive. It was the rapid collapse of every careful thing I had constructed over 3 years, compressed into a single moment of absolute clarity. I turned back to Thierry Moreau. "Marry me instead," I said. The words landed in the quiet between us like a stone dropped into deep water. His expression did not change, not a flicker. But something behind those gray-green eyes went very, very focused. The kind of focus that precedes a decision, not a dismissal. I'm serious, I said, before he could speak. Your brother intends to break this engagement, and he's been in love with my sister for long enough that it's become structurally unsound for everyone involved. The question is whether it ends with maximum damage or minimum damage. I kept my voice even. Professional. The voice I used when presenting restoration assessments to owners who didn't want to hear how bad the rot had gotten. Right now, the scandal is still containable. If you and I formalize something tonight, an understanding, even a public one, the narrative shifts. We control it. Edouard was 6 feet away and closing. I did not look at him. Thierry's gaze had not left my face since I started speaking. It was the most focused attention I had ever received from a person who was not paying me to assess their building. Era, Edouard's voice, warm and practiced. I was looking for you. I'm sure you were, I said pleasantly, and I held Thierry's gaze. A beat of silence. Then Thierry said, his tone utterly unchanged. I'll need 20 minutes. Edouard stopped. Thierry looked at his brother for the first time, a glance so brief and so devastating that I felt the temperature in our small corner of the room drop by several degrees. Excuse us, he said. It was not a request. Edouard looked between us. Something moved in his face, surprise, then something uglier, then the careful neutralization of both. He stepped back. Thierry's hand came to my elbow. Light. Directional. A touch that said this way without saying anything at all. And I walked with him because the only alternative was staying there in the golden light of the Maro estate, while my engagement died in real time. And I had already decided that was not how this evening ended. He took me to a study off the main corridor. Dark wood paneling, a desk that had clearly been used for actual work rather than aesthetic. Bookshelves with the specific kind of organized chaos that meant someone read in here regularly, rather than decorating with spines. He closed the door. He did not sit. He moved to the far side of the desk and looked at me with the same unnerving steadiness he'd had in the salon. Say it again, he said, without the audience. Marry me. Why? I just explained. You explained the strategic framework, he said. I want the actual reason. I held his gaze. Because I've spent 3 years being the practical choice, and I am finished with it. Because your brother is about to humiliate me in a way that will follow me professionally for the next decade, if I don't get ahead of it. And because I paused. And in this part was harder, but I had decided honesty was the only currency that might actually work in this room, with this man. Because I'm good at my work, and I'm tired of being used for it in someone else's story. I want a context in which my competence means something. Thierry was quiet for a long moment. You want to use my name to protect your reputation and your career, he said. I want a transaction, yes. And what do I get? Scandal containment for your family. An end to whatever internal instability your brother's situation was already causing. And I looked around the study, at the documents stacked on the far corner of the desk, the estate maps on the side table, the visible evidence of a man managing an empire through sheer organizational force. Whatever value my professional skills are actually worth in your context, at which I suspect is more than you're currently accounting for. His eyes moved over my face with the specific attention of someone running diagnostics. I watched him do it, watched him work through the calculation, and I noticed, very precisely, the moment when the calculation shifted into something else. Not softer, just different. More deliberate. He looked away first. It was such a small thing. A half-second redirection toward the estate maps on the side table, then back. But I had a feeling Thierry Maro did not look away from things he did not choose to look away from, and I filed that detail without knowing yet what to do with it. You're an architectural preservation specialist, he said. I know your estate has a restoration project tied up in permit delays. I know 3 of your coastal properties are listed under family trust arrangements that have legal complications your current legal team keeps deferring. And I know I let this land carefully. That the Marseille property had unauthorized access through a sealed restoration wing 3 months ago, because the permit file I reviewed as part of my firm's regional survey showed maintenance records that don't align with the sealing date. The silence that followed was different from the others. How did you access that file? He said, very quietly. It was in a regional survey my firm submitted a comparative assessment for. My practice covers coastal heritage properties across the southern region. It's standard professional scope. I watched his face. I'm not telling you this to threaten you. I'm telling you because I want you to understand what I notice and what I'm worth. Another silence. Longer. The clock on the mantelpiece counted it out. Then, "Sit down, Era." I sat. He moved around the desk and took the chair across from me, leaning back in it with the specific ease of a man who was only relaxed when he was in absolute control. He studied me for another moment. "There are conditions," he said. "There always are. You'll be introduced as my fiancé by end of this week. We'll maintain public credibility at all necessary appearances. You will not speak about my business to anyone outside of what I authorize." His voice was level, systematic. "You will not attempt to investigate anything you think you've noticed. If you find something relevant to my interests, you bring it to me first. And what do I get? The public narrative, my name, financial stability sufficient that your firm's reduced hours don't endanger your current obligations." A pause. "And continued access to the Côte d'Azur restoration project, under your name, with proper lead authority. Not as a technical consultant, as the specialist of record." Something in my chest did something I immediately cataloged and set aside. "I want that in writing," I said. "You'll have it. I want a clause about autonomy over my work. No interference from your people, no pressure to falsify assessments. No, I don't falsify," he said. And something in his tone made me believe him. "I find it inefficient. I also want you to understand," I said carefully, "that I am not doing this because I'm broken. And I'm doing this because I've assessed the options, and this one has the best structural integrity." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, the ghost of one. "I'm aware," he said. And the thing about that, the thing I cataloged but did not examine until much later, was that it was the first time in years a man had said "I'm aware" in response to my competence, and meant it as a fact rather than a consolation. We sat in his study for another 40 minutes. When we walked back into the salon together, his hand was at the small of my back, deliberate, authoritative, a hand that said "she is placed," and the room's geometry rearranged itself around that fact immediately. Edouard went white. Camille pressed her lips together and looked at the floor. Thierry's mother looked between her sons and then at me with the expression of a woman recalculating rapidly. I kept my face composed and my shoulders level, and I let the room draw its own conclusions, because that was exactly what we had planned for it to do. But under my skin, my heart was hammering. Not from the performance, from the way his hand hadn't moved. The next 3 days were not quiet. That was the first thing I learned about existing inside Thierry Moreau's orbit. There was no such thing as a calm afternoon. There were only varying degrees of controlled tension. His mother requested a private meeting the morning after the announcement ran, which Thierry attended alongside me without being asked. He said almost nothing. He didn't need to. His presence in the room was its own argument. When I watched Vivienne Moreau recalibrate in real time, not warmly but practically, which I respected more than warmth would have been. "She's sharper than she looks," Vivienne said to Thierry, as if I wasn't there. "She looks exactly as sharp as she is," he said, without inflection. He was looking at the window. "Don't mistake composure for softness." I did not react, but something in my chest registered it, like a structural reading, unexpected load-bearing capacity in a wall I'd assumed was decorative. Edouard called twice. I didn't answer. Camille sent a message that began, "I need you to understand." And I set my phone face down and went back to the Côte d'Azur files, because understanding Camille was a problem I did not currently have the architecture for. The public announcement landed precisely as Thierry had engineered it. In a quiet but significant development, one columnist wrote, while Edouard and Camille's attachment surfaced simultaneously as long-standing affection, a natural realignment. Both stories in a single news cycle. Both fires contained before they could spread. "You managed both narratives at once," I said to him the second morning, when I looked up from my files to find him already watching me from across his office. He had been still for long enough that he'd clearly been watching for some time before I noticed. When I caught him, he did not pretend otherwise. "That was the point," he said, and reached for the document on his desk, with the same unhurried ease as always. but there had been a beat, brief and very deliberate, before he moved. I looked back at my files. It's elegant, I said. As it's efficient. Those aren't mutually exclusive. I marked a section of the Côte d'Azur structural report and kept my voice level. You should know there's an anomaly in the terrace records on the east wing. The load-bearing assessment was filed in March, but the material delivery logs show the reinforcement work wasn't completed until June. Someone filed a completion certificate for work that hadn't been done yet. A pause. How long ago did you notice that? About 4 minutes ago. Do you want me to flag everything like this, or only things above a certain severity threshold? He was quiet in a way that felt like recalibration. Flag everything. All right, I made a note. I'll need access to the full permit archive for the coastal properties, not just the Côte d'Azur one. I'll have it sent over. I looked up again. And he was still watching me, that same attentiveness I was beginning to recognize as particular to him. Not possessive and not evaluating social risk the way men in his world usually looked at women they'd just publicly attached themselves to. It was the look of someone who had encountered something unexpected and was not yet done deciding what it meant. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me, he said. It's useful. Useful. I recognized the word as armor. I recognized it because I had been using the same word for the same purpose my entire adult life. I said nothing, but I heard it. Within days of working through his property files, I had identified 4 permit anomalies across 3 properties, flagged a falsified maintenance certificate. Iron confirmed that the unauthorized access event in the Marseille sealed wing had occurred on at least 2 separate occasions, not 1. I laid it out in a clear written summary and brought it to Thierry's office that evening. He read it without speaking, all of it carefully, then went back to the beginning and read 2 sections again. This is internal, he said, when he looked up. His voice was even, but something behind his eyes had gone very still. Someone inside the organization has been using the restoration access windows to move through properties that should be sealed. Yes. You got all of this from permit files and maintenance logs. And the structural reports. The access pattern is specific. Same entry method each time. Time to coincide with legitimate contractor presence, so the movement blends in. Whoever is doing this understands both how buildings work and how restoration paperwork gets filed. I watched his face. This isn't random. No, he said. It's not. He set the summary down on the desk. The room was very quiet. He looked at me for a long moment, not with the clinical assessment of our first conversation, but with something quieter and more careful. Like a man deciding something he hadn't expected to have to decide so soon. You'll need to move to the estate, he said. I have an apartment, which is connected to you professionally, and which is now connected to me publicly. The access breach you found means someone inside my organization has been mapping movement through my properties for long enough to be very good at it. Until I know who that is, he stopped. Steadied. You're safer here. Or, I said carefully, but you could simply brief me on what you know, and we could work through it without era. The way he said my name, not sharp, but absolute, stopped me mid-sentence. I'm not asking you to shrink, he said. I'm telling you the risk is real. There's a difference. I sat with that for a moment. It was a genuinely different thing from the way I was used to being managed by powerful men. And the fact that I noticed the difference annoyed me, because I did not want to find Thierry Moreau's particular brand of authority more tolerable than Edouard's. That felt like a category error I couldn't afford. 1 week, I said. I'll stay at the estate for 1 week while you assess the internal situation. After that, we renegotiate. He looked at me steadily. But all right, and I want uninterrupted access to the permit archive while I'm here. You'll have it. And I eat dinner when I want to eat dinner, not when someone summons me. The ghost smile again. Barely there, gone before it fully formed. Noted, he said. I stood, gathered my files, and told myself that the particular quality of my heartbeat as I walked out of his office was entirely attributable to the professional stakes, and not at all to the way his eyes had followed me to the door. I told myself that, and I almost believed it. The Maro estate at night was not what I expected. I had worked in enough historic properties to know that old money left a specific kind of residue, a particular quality of silence, as though the walls had absorbed a century of careful conversation and were holding it in. The estate had that, but it also had something else, a tension in its stillness that I recognized, after the first night, as the tension of a house that was always being watched. Staff moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that observation ran in both directions. Every door I opened had already been unlocked before I reached it. Every room I entered had been made exactly ready. It was not hospitality. It was precision. My suite was in the east wing, far enough from Thierry's rooms to be appropriate for the arrangement's public fiction, close enough to the main working corridors that I could reach the archive room without crossing any space I wasn't supposed to cross. I noticed that immediately. The placement was deliberate. He had thought about my access before I arrived. I unpacked my files before I unpacked my clothes. The permit archive was housed in a climate-controlled room off the estate's administrative corridor. 3 walls of document storage, a central table, and a digital catalog system that was thorough enough to be useful and disorganized enough to tell me it had been managed by someone who understood property records technically, but not architecturally, which meant the gaps would be in exactly the places a non-specialist wouldn't think to look. I started at the beginning. The following morning, I was 3 hours into the archive, when the door opened and a man I didn't recognize entered with the ease of someone who considered every room in the building his own. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with the broad, settled frame of a man who had once been powerful physically, and had since redistributed that energy into a more dangerous kind of stillness. Silver at his temples, dark eyes that moved across the room in a single sweep before they settled on me. "Mademoiselle Era," he said pleasantly. I didn't realize Thierry had authorized access to this room. "He did," I said, and did not look up from the document I was reading. A pause. "I'm Voss. I manage property operations for the family." That made me look up, because property operations was precisely the function through which the permit anomalies had been filed, and the name on 3 of the 4 falsified maintenance certificates had been authorized through the operations office. Then I looked at him for a moment with the same careful neutrality I used when a building told me something I needed to think about before I responded to it. "I know the name," I said, "from the permit files." Something moved through his expression, a fractional recalibration, smooth and immediate, replaced by a smile so practiced it had no edges. His eyes dropped briefly to the documents spread across my table before returning to my face, and the pleasantness in them did not waver, which was somehow more unsettling than hostility would have been. "Of course," he said. "Then you'll know how much of this archive I've personally organized over the years. If you have questions about anything you find, I'm the right person to ask." "I'll keep that in mind," I said. He held my gaze for 1 beat longer than was comfortable, and then nodded pleasantly and left. I sat very still for a moment after the door closed. My pulse was steady. I had always been good at keeping my pulse steady, but underneath the steadiness, something cold had settled in my stomach. A man who managed property operations had no reason to personally check on an archive visitor within hours of her arrival, unless he was monitoring what she was looking at, which meant he already knew there was something in here worth monitoring. I wrote his name at the top of a fresh page and underlined it. I brought it to Thierry that evening, the same way I'd brought him the breach summary, directly, without softening it. "Voss came to the archive room this morning," I said. He introduced himself as property operations manager and told me he was the right person to ask if I had questions. I placed the fresh page on his desk beside the permit files. His name appears as authorizing official on 3 of the 4 falsified maintenance certificates. His office would have had primary access to the permit filing timeline, and he came to find me within 16 hours of my arriving at the estate. Thierry looked at the page, then at me. His expression was very controlled in a way that felt like the control was doing significant work. "You're certain about the certificates," he said. "The authorization signatures route through his office. I can't confirm it was his hand, but the operational chain leads there." I paused. "Do you know him well?" 22 years, he said, and the silence that followed had a specific weight. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it precisely, not as comfort, but as acknowledgement of what 22 years of proximity made this cost. He looked at me then with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not softness exactly, something that sat just adjacent to it, a momentary suspension of the usual control, as if the word sorry, said plainly and without performance, had reached past his defenses before he could redirect it. His eyes held mine for a beat too long, and then he looked down at the page, and I had the distinct impression that looking down was a choice rather than a reflex. He picked up the summary. I'll need everything you can build from the archive, documented, sequenced. I know, I gathered my files. But I'll have a full structural analysis of the access pattern within a few days. Era, I turned at the door. Don't go anywhere in this estate alone until I've spoken to my security chief. He said it without drama, which made it more serious, not less. Voss knows you're looking at those files. He will have understood what that means. The thing that my heartbeat did in response to that, the specific way it registered not the threat, but the fact that he'd thought about the threat before I had, was something I filed away carefully and chose not to examine. Understood, I said. My phone rang the next morning before I reached the archive. My firm's director, whose calls I had been managing with careful brevity since the engagement announcement. Era. His tone had the particular quality of a man choosing words. The Côte d'Azur project board is asking for your confirmed timeline. They expected a preliminary assessment submission last week. I'll have it to them by Thursday, I said. There's also the question of your current situation. A careful pause. The firm's position is that any personal arrangement that affects your professional availability needs to be managed transparently. We've had 2 clients ask whether you're still taking independent assessments, which meant the whispers had reached professional circles, which meant the scandal hadn't been as cleanly contained as Thierry's public narrative suggested. Or rather, it had been contained on one level and had simply migrated to another. I'm still taking assessments, I said. Nothing has changed professionally. Good, he said, in a tone that meant he wasn't entirely convinced, but was willing to accept the answer for now. Thursday, then. I hung up and stood for a moment in the corridor outside the archive. The financial arrangement Thierry had formalized gave me stability, but stability was not reputation. And reputation in my field was the only currency that compounded. If clients were asking questions, the next stage was clients quietly redirecting their projects to someone less complicated. I had not fought this hard to let that happen quietly. I went into the archive and worked for 6 uninterrupted hours. Within those days of working through his property files, I had identified 4 permit anomalies across 3 properties, flagged a falsified maintenance certificate, and confirmed that the unauthorized access event in the Marseille sealed wing had occurred on at least 2 separate occasions, not one. But buried deeper in the archive's property transfer records was something worse. A pattern of access authorizations that didn't correspond to any legitimate restoration window. 12 entries across 8 properties over 14 months. Each one filed under a different contractor code, but all sharing a single anomalous characteristic. They had been approved outside normal operational hours, and each approval had been routed through a secondary authorization channel that bypassed the standard sign-off sequence, which meant someone had not only been moving through sealed properties, they had built a parallel authorization infrastructure to cover the movement retroactively. This was not opportunistic access. This was a system. I brought it to Thierry in his private office, not the formal one, the one with the estate maps and the window that looked out over the water. He was already there when I arrived, standing at the window with the phone to his ear, and he held up one finger without turning around. I sat down and waited. I had a clear view of his profile from where I sat, the particular quality of his stillness while he listened, the slight tension across his shoulders that was the only indication the call was not routine. He was wearing a dark shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbow, which I noticed the way I noticed everything in spaces I was learning to read, cataloging without deciding what to do with the information yet. He finished the call in 2 clipped sentences, set the phone down, and turned. And his eyes went to the folder in my hands immediately. Tell me, he said. I laid it out. He listened without interrupting, all of it, the full pattern, the parallel authorization channel, the 14-month timeline. When I finished, he was very still in the specific way I was learning, meant the stillness was deliberate, held, not natural. This is a complete shadow system, he said. Yes. Whoever built it had sufficient technical access to create it, and sufficient operational knowledge to keep it invisible inside normal maintenance traffic. I held his gaze. This isn't someone acting alone for personal gain. This is someone building infrastructure for something larger. He turned back to the window. The water outside was dark and flat in the evening light. I watched the line of his shoulders and said nothing. Because I was beginning to understand that Thierry Moreau processed his most significant realizations in the direction of windows, and interrupting that process was not useful. How many people know you found this, he said. Only you. He turned back then and looked at me with an expression that was both assessment and something that had stopped being purely assessment several days ago. And we both knew it, and neither of us had said so. You understand, he said carefully, that this changes the risk to you, significantly. I understand. And you're still sitting there. Where else would I be, I said. This is my work. This is what I see. A beat of silence. He crossed the room to the desk, close enough that I was aware of the warmth and size of him passing, at the particular displaced air of someone moving with total deliberate control, and he looked at the documents I'd spread across the surface. I need to move some people, he said, quietly. Until I do, I want you in the secure wing. Thierry, not a request, he said. Then, with slightly less authority and slightly more something else, please. The word landed the way it always landed when he used it, like something that had cost him the decision to offer it. I had spent 3 years with a man who issued requests as though they were concessions and called compliance devotion. The word please from Thierry Moreau, measured and deliberate, did something to the careful structure I had built around my own wanting. All right, I said. The secure wing occupied the estate's original fortified structure, older stone, narrower corridors, and windows that were architectural features rather than practical ones. My relocated room was smaller than the East Wing suite, and furnished with the spare efficiency of a space designed for necessity rather than comfort. It also shared a sitting room with the only other occupied suite in the wing, Thierry's. He told me this as a fact, without apology, which I appreciated even as it made the back of my neck warm in a way I was determined to ignore. The layout is what it is, he said, standing in the sitting room doorway. There's a lock on each suite door. Use it if you want to. I'm not afraid of you, I said. I know. Something in his expression shifted. That fractional thing I was beginning to recognize as the closest he came to wry humor. That wasn't the concern. I looked at him for a moment. He looked back. The sitting room between us was very quiet and very small, and full of a particular quality of air that I chose not to analyze. Good night, Moreau, I said. Good night, Era, he said, and went into his suite and closed the door. I stood in the sitting room alone for a moment. Then I went to my room and did not lock the door. I told myself it was because I wasn't afraid, which was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. 3 days into the secure wing arrangement, someone tampered with my car. I found it because I noticed what I always noticed, a structural inconsistency. The angle of the driver's side mirror was wrong, not dramatically wrong, a few degrees. But I had parked it myself, and I had a precise memory for spatial detail. And the mirror angle I'd set was not the mirror angle I was looking at. I did not touch the car, and I walked back into the estate, found Thierry's security chief, a compact, watchful man named Felix, and told him in 3 sentences what I'd found. Felix had the car examined within the hour. The brake line had been partially compromised, not severed. That would have been too immediate and too obvious. Weakened in a way that would have become critical at speed on a downhill road. Thierry was in the estate's main office when Felix brought him the report. I was there because Felix had asked me to be. I had found it, he said. I should hear the confirmation. I watched Thierry read the report. I watched his hands go flat against the desk on either side of it. I watched the stillness in his body become a different kind of stillness. Not the window processing kind, not the assessment kind. And the line of his shoulders had gone very still in a way that was more frightening than any expression would have been. Something cold and precise moving through him, like water finding the lowest point of a structure before it begins to press. He read it once, set it down, said to Felix very quietly, "Get Voss," Tell him I need to review the perimeter authorization logs. Don't tell him why. Felix left. Thierry did not move for a moment. Then he turned to look at me, and the expression on his face was something I had not seen before. Not the controlled assessment, not the ghost smile, not the careful deliberation. Something stripped of all of that. Raw and brief and immediately contained, like a door opened and closed in a single second. "Are you hurt?" he said. "I didn't drive it," I said. "As I noticed before I got in." "That isn't what I asked." The distinction landed precisely where he intended it. "Are you hurt?" was not a damage assessment. It was the question underneath the question. "No," I said, more quietly. "I'm not hurt." He held my gaze for a moment that stretched past what either of us would normally have allowed. Then he straightened, and the control reassembled itself over whatever had surfaced, and he said, "Stay in the wing tonight. I'll know more by morning." I nodded. But I stayed where I was for another moment, because my legs were not entirely steady, and I had not admitted that to myself until just now, and I did not want him to see it. He saw it anyway. He said nothing. He simply moved to the window, giving me the room, the way you give someone room who needs it, but won't ask for it, and then looked out at the courtyard and waited until I had gathered myself back together. It was the most considerate thing anyone had done for me in recent memory. The fact that he'd done it without making it visible made it more so. I left the office and did not look back. What happened next, Thierry handled with the surgical precision that I was beginning to understand, was his truest nature. He did not confront Voss. He did not accuse him. He spent the following days methodically dismantling the authorization structure Voss had built over 14 months, rerouting every access channel through a new security layer, freezing Voss's operational authority piece by piece, making him invisible within his own domain while the full evidentiary picture was assembled. I knew this because Thierry told me. Each step, each decision, he brought it to me the way I brought my analyses to him. Not because he needed my approval, but because at some point in the past 2 weeks, we had stopped presenting findings to each other and started thinking out loud in the same room, which was a different thing entirely. The morning he finished the freeze, he came to the archive room where I was working, sat down across the table, and said, "It's done. He can't authorize, access, or direct anything in the property operation without my knowledge." "He'll know," I said. "Yes. He'll know I know, which means he'll either run or he'll escalate." He looked at me steadily. "Either way, he'll move, and when he moves, I'll see it. You're using the situation as bait." "There's a difference between using the situation and being reckless," he said. "Is there?" I held his gaze. "Say, because from where I'm sitting, you've just made yourself the most visible target in your own operation." Something shifted in his expression, not defensiveness. Something more interesting than that. The slight recalibration of a man who was not accustomed to being read accurately and was deciding how to feel about it. His eyes stayed on mine a moment longer than the conversation required, and I felt it the way I felt a room's temperature. Not dramatically, but precisely and all over. "I've been the target in my own operation for longer than you've been in it," he said quietly. "The difference now is that I know which direction the pressure is coming from." I looked at him for a moment. Then, "That's still a yes." The ghost smile, barely there, gone before it finished forming. My phone buzzed that afternoon with a message from Camille. "And I know this is complicated. I need you to know I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I read it twice." I set the phone face down. I picked up my pen and went back to the document I'd been working on, and I wrote 3 full lines of structural notation before I realized I had no idea what I'd written. I didn't mean for it to happen this way, as though meaning were the relevant metric, as though intent absolved architecture. I had spent 3 years building something careful and real, and she had been standing behind me the whole time, not quite meeting my eyes when I talked about the wedding, not quite present when Edward was in the room, and I had told myself it was nothing because the alternative, that I had been the practical arrangement all along while my own sister was the one he actually wanted. I was a shape I couldn't look at directly. I could look at it now. It still felt like pressing a bruise. But what surprised me, sitting in that archive room in the fortified wing with the old stone walls and the climate-controlled silence, was that the bruise felt further away than I expected. as though something in the past few weeks had shifted the center of gravity of my life, enough that the old hurt was real but no longer central. I did not examine what that meant. Not yet. I texted back. I know you didn't. We'll talk properly when this is over. Then I turned the phone face down and went back to work. 2 weeks into the secure wing arrangement, Thierry found me still in the archive room at past 11 at night. I had been there for 6 hours. My back ached. My notes covered the full length of the central table. I had stopped noticing the time, which was a habit I'd had since graduate school and had never successfully broken, and which had apparently been driving Edward quietly mad for years, because he experienced my focus as a form of absence. I was only just beginning to understand how much energy I had spent apologizing for it. Thierry stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing himself. I looked up and felt a specific quality of surprise at finding him there, not because it was alarming, but because it wasn't. The surprise was at how natural it felt, how quickly this particular room with this particular person had started to feel like something I returned to, rather than something I entered. He crossed the room and set a plate on the one empty corner of the table, something from the kitchen, simple and warm, and then pulled the chair from the opposite side around to sit adjacent to me rather than across from me. It was such a small thing, the geometry of it. Beside instead of opposite. I looked at the plate and then at him, and something about that particular act, practical, unannounced, requiring him to come find me in a room he didn't need to be in, made my throat tighten in a way I suppressed immediately, because that was what I did. I suppressed the evidence of being moved by being considered, because being moved by it meant I had been starved of it, and acknowledging that felt too close to the version of myself I was trying to stop being. "Thank you," I said. Don't thank you," I finished. "I know, but I'm going to anyway." The ghost smile. He looked at the notes on the table. How far have you gotten?" "Far enough to know this runs deeper than Voss alone," I said. "The shadow system has a secondary layer I haven't fully mapped yet. Someone helped him build it. The technical architecture is too clean for one person." I pulled the relevant page toward him. "Look at this authorization sequence. The primary channel and the override channel were built simultaneously, which means from the beginning there were 2 people with design access." He leaned forward to look at the page. His shoulder was close enough to mine that I could feel the warmth of him, the particular quality of his stillness in close proximity, which was different from his stillness at a distance, denser, more present, more difficult to ignore. And I kept my eyes on the page and told myself that was a professional habit, rather than an act of self-preservation. "A partner," he said. "Or a superior," I said. "Someone who gave Voss the technical framework, and then kept their distance from the operational layer." He was quiet for a moment, long enough that I looked at him. His expression was set in a way I recognized as the precursor to something he was deciding whether to say. I waited, because I had learned that pushing him toward speech before he was ready produced clipped answers that contained less truth than the silence he was working through. "My brother," he said, "has been pressing to take over the coastal property portfolio for 6 months. I went very still. "Edouard," I said. "He doesn't have the technical knowledge to build something like this," Thierry said. "But he has always been very good at finding people who do, and very good at staying one layer above operational culpability." He looked at me. "I want to be clear. This is what I suspect, not what I can yet prove. You found the architecture. I'm telling you the context." That distinction was deliberate. I registered it, and registered that he had offered it without being asked, which was its own kind of statement. "That's why you accepted the proposal," I said slowly. "Not just for the scandal containment. You already suspected Edouard was positioning himself, and in the engagement was about to give him a reason to press closer to the operational center." "Yes." "And when I walked up to you at that dinner and told you about the Marseille axis anomaly within the same conversation, you were already inside the picture without knowing it," he said, "which made you either part of it or the clearest view of it I'd encountered." A pause. "I believed the second, but I needed to be certain before I told you the full context." I sat with that for a long moment. The anger was there. I felt it clearly, the specific shape of it. The familiar outline of being arranged around rather than consulted, of someone deciding what I needed to know about my own situation. The oldest architecture of my life, You are useful here. We will tell you what serves the plan. But this was different in a way I needed to be honest about, even internally. He had told me now, without me having to extract it. He had distinguished between what he knew and what he suspected, which was more intellectual honesty than most people offered when the truth was inconvenient. You used the arrangement, I said. Not as an accusation, as a fact to be named. I gave you what you asked for, he said. The project, the authority, the access, the protection. None of that was false. He held my gaze. But yes, the urgency of your presence here served my purposes as well as yours. Those two things were simultaneously true. And you didn't tell me. No, he said. I didn't. Because you decided it was better for me not to know. He didn't answer immediately. And in the pause, in the specific quality of his not answering, and I heard his wound clearly for the first time, the man who had learned that the safest way to protect what mattered was to manage the information around it, who had spent so long equating control with care that the distinction had blurred into something he no longer recognized as a choice. Because I wasn't certain yet, he said finally. And uncertainty is not something I share until I've built the full picture. That's a different answer than better for you, I said. Yes, he said. It is. Another silence. The archive room held it without judgment. Tell me the rest, I said. All of it. Whatever you know and whatever you suspect. Not because I'll be safer with it, though I will, but because I'm in this whether you brief me or not. And I would rather be in it with the full truth than without it. He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression was doing significant work. The cost of the next decision visible not in any single feature, but in the quality of his stillness. The sense of a man choosing to put down something heavy he had been carrying for a very long time. Then he told me. We stayed in that archive room until past 1 a.m, building the picture together, what he knew about Edward's movements, what I'd found in the records, where the gaps were, and what they likely meant. By the time we stopped, the shape of it was visible. Voss as the operational architect, Edward as the strategic beneficiary. A plan to redirect the family's coastal property network through a restructured authorization chain that would shift real operational control away from Thierry. It was sophisticated. And the kind of plan that only worked if no one looked too carefully at the restoration paperwork. If you hadn't found the permit anomaly at our first meeting, Thierry said, gathering the documents into sequence, how long before someone would have noticed? At the rate the coastal portfolio was being filed, another 8 months perhaps. If someone ran a full structural audit, I paused, which doesn't happen routinely unless a property is being sold or developed. He looked at me. You found the East Wing anomaly in 4 minutes. 4 minutes for that one, I said. The full pattern took longer. 4 minutes, he repeated quietly, and something in his voice was so precisely certain, not impressed the way people were impressed by a trick, but certain the way people were certain of load-bearing facts, that I had to look away. I stood, at stretching the ache from my back, and began stacking my notes into order. He stood at the other end of the table, and for a moment we were both still. The archive room holding us in its particular quiet, the distance between us small enough that the warmth of the room felt like it came from both of us, the hour late enough that the ordinary calibrations that kept us careful had softened at their edges. Era, he said. I looked at him. He was looking at me with an expression I had no architecture for yet. Not the assessment, not the ghost smile, not the controlled authority. Something that had grown quietly in the space between documents and late evenings and careful distances, maintained at considerable personal cost. Something that was in his eyes and in the particular quality of his stillness, and in the fact that he had said my name, my actual name, as though it was the word he'd meant to say for some time and had only just permitted himself. He looked at me with it for one long moment. Then he reached across and picked up the last of the documents from my side of the table and placed them on the stack. Thank you, he said, for not leaving when you found out. It was not a declaration of anything. It was simply a truth, offered plainly, without strategy, the way I'd said sorry 2 weeks ago. I don't leave things I haven't finished, I said. He held my gaze. I know. I walked back to the secure wing with my files under my arm and the sound of my own name in his voice, doing something I didn't have language for yet. Everything I had built to keep myself safe was shifting. The foundations were not broken. They were simply being asked to bear a different weight than I had designed them for. And the worst part was that I wasn't sure I wanted to reinforce them. I submitted the Côte d'Azur preliminary assessment on a Thursday morning, 3 days past the deadline, with a cover note to the project board explaining that additional structural anomalies had been identified requiring expanded scope. It was not untrue. It was also the most diplomatic version of I have been living in a fortified wing of the subject property's owner's estate, while mapping a criminal access network through his family's holdings, and I thought my director would appreciate the discretion. He called within the hour. The board accepted the expanded scope, he said, with the tone of a man who had been holding his breath. They want the full assessment within a month. They'll have it, I said. A pause. Era, are you all right? It was the first time he had asked me that directly, rather than asking about the work, and the unexpectedness of it caught me somewhere unguarded. I stood at the window of the secure wing's sitting room and looked out at the estate's south garden and thought about what all right meant in the context of the past 6 weeks. I'm working, I said. That's usually the same thing. He accepted that. He always had. I hung up and went back to the archive, and it was there, 2 hours later, with the secondary authorization layer half mapped across my table, that I heard the sound of a car on the estate's front approach that I didn't recognize. Not Thierry's, not Felix's security rotation. A different engine, unhurried, but pulling up with the specific confidence of someone who had every right to be here. I went to the archive's narrow window. Edouard Maro stepped out of the car and looked up at the estate's facade, with the expression of a man surveying something he intended to own. I had not seen him since the engagement dinner. In the weeks between, he had existed in my mind as an abstract, the soft center of a harder problem, the beneficiary rather than the architect. Seeing him in person, in the pale morning light of the estate courtyard, I was struck by how little he had changed, and how differently I was seeing him. He had always been handsome in an easy, uncomplicated way, the kind of face that opened doors by existing rather than by doing anything particular. He was wearing that face now, which meant he intended to use it. I moved away from the window and stayed where I was. 15 minutes later, Felix appeared in the archive doorway. Monsieur Edouard is requesting a brief conversation, he said, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering a message whose contents he disapproved of. He says it's a personal matter. Where is Thierry? In Nice for a meeting, not back until this evening. Of course, I thought about refusing. I thought about it for exactly 4 seconds, and then I thought, if Edouard is here, there is information in this room that I want, and the only way to get it is to let him think he has the advantage. Tell him I'll meet him in the front drawing room, I said. Give me 5 minutes. He was standing at the drawing room's fireplace when I entered, in the posture of a man who had chosen his position carefully, central, warm. I elevated. I recognized it as social architecture. I had been reading buildings long enough to recognize when a person was using one. Era, he said warmly, as though we were friends who had lost touch rather than two people whose engagement had detonated at a family dinner 6 weeks ago. Edouard, I said, and sat down in the chair nearest the door, which was not the chair he had probably expected me to take. Something flickered in his expression. Then the warmth resumed. You look well. You didn't drive out here to tell me that. He smiled. That easy, practiced smile I had once found reassuring. No, I came because I'm concerned about you. He moved to the chair across from me, unhurried, and settled into it with the comfort of a man who did not believe he was the problem in any room he occupied. Thierry can be overwhelming, especially for someone who came into this situation without fully understanding what his world involves. I understand his world reasonably well at this point, I said. Do you? His tone was gentle, carefully gentle, the gentleness of someone who wanted to be seen as kind while delivering something sharp. Because from where I sit, you walked into a very complicated situation in a moment of understandable emotion, and now you're isolated in this estate, involved in things that have nothing to do with you, and being, I suspect, given a very selective version of events. I looked at him steadily. What selective version do you mean, specifically? A pause. He was recalibrating, had expected more defensiveness, more uncertainty, I watched him adjust. Thierry has a way of positioning people, he said, making them feel essential, at making them feel like they're the only one who truly understands the situation. He held my gaze. I would hate for you to have made permanent decisions based on a picture he constructed for you. And you're offering me the corrected picture, I said. I'm offering you a conversation. About the coastal property portfolio. The warmth in his expression cooled by precisely 1 degree. Among other things. Edouard. I kept my voice pleasant even, the voice I used in professional meetings when someone had just tried to redirect the assessment findings toward a conclusion they'd pre-decided. You came here because Thierry froze Voss's authorization access, and you needed to understand how much has been found. This isn't a welfare visit, it's reconnaissance. The silence that followed was sharp-edged. His face did something complicated. And then, you've been very useful to him, haven't you? I've been very good at my work, I said. That's not the same thing. He stood. The easy warmth had gone entirely now, and what was underneath it was not dramatic, just cold and flat, and entirely consistent with a man who had chosen the practical option when the emotional one became inconvenient. I recognized it because I had been on the receiving end of it before, in a different form, from a different face. Your professional reputation is more fragile than you think, he said quietly. I know 3 people on the Coastal Heritage Board. I know your firm's director. And I know that the story of how you ended up in this estate, in this arrangement, I could be told in ways that would make it very difficult for anyone in this industry to trust your assessments as objective. He looked at me with something that might have been regret if it had any warmth in it. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you what's true. You are threatening me, I said. And I've noted exactly what you said. He left. I sat in the drawing room for a long moment after the car had gone. My hands were steady. My pulse was elevated but controlled. I was very, very angry, and the anger was clean and clear and directional. Not the diffuse, humiliated anger of the engagement dinner, but the precise anger of someone who has been shown exactly where the rod is and knows what to do with the information. I went back to the archive and worked until Thierry came home. I told him about Edouard's visit the moment he walked through the door, before he'd set down his coat, before he'd had time to arrange himself into the composed authority he wore like a second skin. I wanted to see his unguarded reaction, and I got it. He went very still. Not the window stillness, the other kind. He was here, he said, for approximately 20 minutes. He implied I was being given a selective version of events, and suggested my professional reputation could be made precarious if I didn't. I paused. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Thierry set his coat down slowly. He turned to face me fully, and something in his expression was working hard, in a way that I had learned to read as the precursor to information he did not want to give me. I waited. He said nothing. Thierry, I said carefully, what do you know about my professional reputation that I don't? A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. He's been speaking to your firm's clients, Thierry said. Not directly, through intermediaries, suggesting that your recent personal situation represents a conflict of interest in your heritage assessments. I became aware of it for over a week. The room went very quiet. For over a week, I said. Yes. And you didn't tell me. He said nothing, and in his silence I heard the same architecture I had heard in the archive weeks ago. The man who managed information as a form of care, who had decided what I needed to know and when I needed to know it, who had built a careful picture of his own protection around the raw edges of a truth that belonged to me. Why, I said. Because I was dealing with it, he said. And I had people addressing the intermediaries. I was building a counter case. I didn't want you to. To what? My voice was level. It cost me something to keep it level. Panic? React badly? Make a decision you hadn't approved? To be frightened, he said. And it came out with a rawness that I hadn't expected, which almost undid my anger, which made me angrier. That is not your decision to make, I said. What is happening to my professional reputation is my life, not a situation to be managed, not a variable in your operational picture. My life, I stopped, steadied. I came into this arrangement with very specific terms. Autonomy over my work. No interference. Do you remember that conversation? Yes. And you decided that didn't extend to threats against my professional standing being actively managed without my knowledge. You decided, I said. That's exactly it. You decided alone what I should know and when, because you were handling it, and that was sufficient. I looked at him across the room, this man I had been watching for 6 weeks, whose careful distances and deliberate words and ghost smiles I had been cataloging with the specific attention of someone who was not supposed to be doing that. And I felt the full weight of my oldest wound pressing against the inside of my chest. He chose for you. He arranged around you. He kept you useful and protected and uninformed, which is its own kind of invisible. Thierry, and I have spent my entire adult life being the person other people make decisions about rather than decisions with. I will not do it again. This is not the same, isn't it? I said. Tell me the difference. From the inside, tell me how being strategically protected without being consulted is different from being strategically placed without being consulted. Because from where I'm standing, the mechanism is identical. The only variable is the intention. The silence after that was the longest we'd had. He looked at me with something that was not defensiveness and not dismissal. Something that was, I thought, the expression of a man who had just been shown the full architectural drawing of something he had been living inside without realizing its shape. You're right, he said quietly. I had not expected that. At the unexpectedness of it moved through me like a structural shift. The particular sensation of a wall you have been pressing against suddenly choosing not to resist. I stood with it for a moment. The anger was still there, but the shape of it had changed. It was no longer a wall between us. It was something more honest than that. A current, running through the space, carrying something neither of us had named yet. I had a choice. I could leave, take the acknowledgement as the point at which I withdrew, protect myself with the distance I'd been maintaining for 6 weeks, keep the wound closed. It was the familiar architecture, the safe one. Or I could stay and work and trust that you're right meant something real. I picked up the folder from the table. Then you should know, I said. Ought that I've spent today building a countermove. He looked at the folder, then at me. Something in his expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but the particular quality of a man who has just been shown that the woman across the room chose to stay rather than leave, and understands exactly what that cost her. Tell me, he said. I told him. The family property review meeting was scheduled for the following week, a legitimate biannual assessment of the coastal portfolio, the kind of meeting that required Edward's formal attendance as a family stakeholder and Voss's operational presence as property manager. Both of them in the same room, in a building I now knew better than either of them. The estate's original west wing, the section currently undergoing formal restoration. I had 3 access corridors that weren't on the primary architectural plans. They appeared only in the original construction surveys, which I had been working from for weeks. One of those corridors connected the guest reception area to the operations archive room through a route that bypassed the main security check-in, which meant that if the operations archive contained the right documents, specifically a staged set of authorization records that appeared to complete the shadow system's secondary layer, and if Voss and Edward believed those documents were about to be independently submitted to an external heritage authority as part of my legitimate assessment report, they would need to access that archive before the meeting, through the corridor only I knew about, where Felix's team would be waiting. That you designed a trap using the building, Thierry said, when I finished. I designed a trap using my knowledge of the building, I said, which is the only kind I know how to build. He looked at me for a moment with that expression, the one I still didn't have full architecture for, and then he said, "What do you need from me?" Access to the operations archive to stage the documents. Felix and his team positioned without Voss's knowledge, and I paused. You need to be at the meeting, visibly, so neither of them thinks the trap has been set. Which means you'll be managing the corridor end without me present. For approximately 40 minutes, yes. The line of his shoulders shifted. That specific quality of stillness that meant a decision was being made at some cost. He was choosing to trust a plan he did not control. And in 8 weeks I had come to understand exactly how much that cost him. All right, he said. It was the most significant thing he had ever offered me. The plan did not go cleanly, Plans rarely did when the people you were trapping were intelligent. Voss moved early, not to the archive. He was too careful for that. Instead, the morning before the review meeting, I found a message on my professional email from an anonymous account, a forwarded chain of correspondence between Edward's intermediaries and two members of my firm's client roster, containing a neatly edited version of my situation that removed all context and left only the outline of a woman who had moved into a criminal family's estate and was now producing assessments from inside their property holdings. It was surgical. And it was designed specifically to reach me before the meeting so that I would either confront Thierry in a way that disrupted the plan or panic and withdraw from the trap entirely. I did neither. I forwarded the correspondence to my firm's director with a 3-line explanation and a request to hold all responses until I contacted him the following day. Then I saved the anonymous message's metadata, cross-referenced the sending pattern against the shadow system's access timestamps in the archive, and confirmed that the message had been composed and sent from within the estate network. Voss was still here, still had some residual access I hadn't mapped, which meant he was watching me now, closely enough to time a message to my professional email to the exact morning of the review. I went to find the access point I'd missed, and I found it in the East Wing's secondary server room, a maintenance terminal with a guest credential that had been created 14 months ago and never formally closed. It was in a corridor I hadn't prioritized because it wasn't part of the restoration zone. I had been reading the wrong section of the building. I stood in that corridor for a moment after I found it. The stone here was older than the rest of the East Wing, darker, cooler, the particular chill of walls that didn't get direct light, the kind of corridor that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. My heartbeat was steady but present. The specific elevated rhythm of someone who has just understood that she has been inside a trap she didn't recognize, and that the trap's architect is still somewhere in the same building. I photographed the terminal. I documented the credential and turned to leave. The door at the far end of the corridor opened. Voss walked in. He looked at me with the same pleasant expression he'd worn in the archive on that first morning. But the pleasantness had run out of something to sustain it. What was underneath it was a great deal colder. "You found the terminal," he said. "I found the terminal," I agreed. I did not move toward the door behind me or the door behind him. I stood where I was, in the middle of the corridor, with my phone in my hand and the photographs already uploaded to the secure drive I shared with Felix. "You're very good at this," he said, moving toward me slowly, with the careful pace of a man who did not want to appear to be doing what he was doing. "Thierry chose well. I chose myself," I said. He just agreed with the choice. He stopped about 6 feet away. His eyes went to my phone. "Those photographs won't matter," he said, "if you're not in a position to present them." "They're already uploaded," I said, "to a drive that Felix accesses automatically every 4 hours. The last upload was 3 hours and 51 minutes ago." I held his gaze. "So you have approximately 9 minutes before those photographs are in his hands, regardless of my position." The pleasantness left Voss's face entirely, and then the door behind me opened and Thierry was there. He took in the corridor, Voss, me, the distance between us, the quality of the air, in approximately 1 second. His eyes moved from Voss to me, and what I saw in them in that moment was not the clinical assessment, and not the ghost smile, and not the controlled authority. And it was something I had no word for yet, something that had been building for 8 weeks and had just, under pressure, finally come fully to the surface where I could see all of it. "Felix," he said, into the earpiece I hadn't noticed he was wearing. "East Wing secondary corridor, now." He did not take his eyes off me while he said it. Voss looked between us. He understood in the particular way that intelligent people understand when a situation has shifted irrevocably, that the room had changed. He straightened. He said nothing further. Felix arrived in 4 minutes. Afterward, in the estate's private study, after Felix had managed Voss, after the review meeting had been quietly restructured, after the documentation had been formally transferred to the appropriate legal channel, Thierry and I sat in the room where, 8 weeks ago, I had proposed to him across a desk in a moment of absolute clarity. It felt like a different room, or possibly we were different people. "You came for me," I said. "You weren't supposed to be in the East Wing. I wasn't, he said. I left the meeting early. Why? He looked at me for a long moment. The evening light was low and the room was very quiet, and I could feel the specific quality of this silence, the pressurized, attentive kind, the kind from our very first conversation that asked something of you without specifying what. Except now I knew what it was asking. Because I gave you my word that anything touching your safety came to you first, he said. And then I spent 40 minutes in a meeting room knowing that you were managing the East Wing corridor alone, and he stopped. Started again. And I have spent 8 weeks being very careful about the distance between what I allow myself and what I want. I would like to stop being careful about that. My heartbeat did what it had been doing since the first evening in this room. The particular hammering that I had been rationalizing as professional stakes, and managed proximity and every other explanation except the accurate one. You withheld information from me, I said. Again, tonight. You knew you were leaving the meeting and you didn't tell me. Yes, he said. I did. He held my gaze. Because if I told you I was coming, you would have told me not to, and his voice was very quiet. I was not able to stay in that room. The admission cost him something visible. I could see the cost of it. At the specific vulnerability of a man who had kept himself sealed for long enough, that opening was a physical effort, not a decision. Thierry, I said, and my voice came out softer than I'd intended. I have spent a great deal of my life, he said carefully, understanding that the people who matter become the places where pressure is applied. That affection is leverage. That caring openly is the same as publishing a weakness. He looked at me with something that had no armor left over it. And then you walked across a salon in a blue dress and proposed to me in front of my brother and told me about a permit anomaly in the same breath. And I have not been careful in the way I intended to be since approximately that moment. The room was very still. That's the longest thing you've ever said to me, I said. Something broke in his expression, not tragically, cleanly, the way a window breaks to let in air. I know, he said. I crossed the room to him, which was a choice I made with the full understanding of what I was choosing. And I put my hand against his chest, not tentative, not testing, but deliberate. The way I touched old walls I wanted to understand. And I felt his heart beat under my palm. It was not steady. His was not steady either. He looked down at my hand, and then at my face and the last of the distance between us. The careful, costly 8-week distance simply ran out. He kissed me the way I had understood, somewhere beneath all my careful cataloging, that he would, not gently, not tentatively, but with the specific intensity of restraint that has finally been given permission to end. His hands came to my face, my waist, and pulling me closer with a certainty that felt less like desire and more like relief. The relief of something that had been true for a very long time, finally being allowed to be true out loud. I kissed him back with everything I had not said in 8 weeks. The argument was still there, somewhere in the room. The withheld information, the management instinct, the cost of his wound and the cost of mine, and the specific difficulty of two people who had both been hurt by attachment, learning to trust it again. All of that was still there, and it would need to be addressed, and it would be hard. But the kiss was harder and more honest and more overdue than anything I had experienced in 3 years of being the practical choice. And when I finally pulled back enough to look at him, he was looking at me with an expression I finally had architecture for. Seen, I thought. This is what it feels like to be seen. We still have to deal with Edouard, I said, because I was who I was. He let out a breath that might, in another life, have been a laugh. Tomorrow, he said, and his voice was different, rougher, quieter, stripped of the usual careful precision in a way that made my chest ache with something I was only beginning to have words for. Tomorrow, I agreed. He pressed his forehead to mine, and neither of us moved for a long moment, and the room held us in its particular quiet. And outside the estate's south garden, the October evening had gone dark and still and completely indifferent to the fact that something in both of us had finally stopped being afraid. And the morning after the kiss, I woke before the estate did. I lay still for a moment in the narrow bed of the secure wing and catalogued the specific quality of the air, different from every other morning I had spent in this room. Not because anything in the room had changed, because something in me had, and the room was simply reflecting that back. I got up, I dressed. I went to the archive. He found me there an hour later, which I had understood he would. We had been finding each other in this room for weeks, and whatever had shifted last night had not changed the basic architecture of how we moved through the estate. What had changed was the quality of the silence when he walked in. The specific awareness of him crossing the room, pulling his usual chair adjacent rather than opposite without thinking about it. I setting a cup of coffee beside my notes, not across the table, beside my notes. I looked at it, then at him. "Good morning," he said, with the careful precision of a man who understood that the morning after a significant thing requires the same steadiness as every other morning, and was choosing to offer that rather than something more uncertain. "Good morning," I said. He had spent part of that morning managing the professional fallout from leaving the niece meeting early, which I learned in the first 10 minutes, 3 calls, a carefully worded explanation that had satisfied no one entirely, and a rescheduled meeting that cost him a political alliance he had been cultivating for several months. He mentioned it without drama, as a fact, as though it was simply part of the accounting. "You didn't tell me you were leaving the meeting early last night," I said. "No," he said. "I didn't. Because I would have told you not to." "Yes." He held my gaze steadily across the archive table. "I've been thinking about the difference between choices that are made for someone and choices that are made because of someone. Last night was the second kind. I needed you to know that." I looked at him for a moment. "That distinction is going to require a great deal more conversation." "I know," he said. "I'm prepared for that." We worked in companionable quiet for 20 minutes before he said, without looking up from his document, "Edouard has been asked to come to the estate this afternoon. Formally." I set down my pen. "The confrontation." "Yes." He looked at me then. "I want you present. As a witness. As the person who built the case," he said. "It is your work. You should be there when it lands." I looked at him for a moment. This man who had, 8 weeks ago, described everything I did as useful, and was now describing my work as something that belonged to me and deserved to be present at its own completion. "All right," I said. Edouard arrived at the estate that afternoon with the practiced ease of a man who had not yet understood that the room he was walking into had been arranged specifically around what he had done. He saw me first. Something moved through his expression, calculation, then the quick neutral smile. "Era. I didn't realize this was a family meeting." "It is now," Thierry said, from the far end of the room. And what followed was not dramatic in the way that confrontations in Edouard's world were usually dramatic. There were no raised voices, no threats, no performance of power. Thierry laid the documentation on the table with the specific economy of a man who had spent decades understanding that evidence speaks more permanently than anger. 12 entries, 8 properties, 14 months, the parallel authorization infrastructure, the secondary channel built simultaneously with the primary, 2 people, design access confirmed, Voss's operational role, and the financial transfer records that Felix's team had recovered from the terminal in the East Wing server room, which showed a series of payments from a private account registered to a shell company that traced, through 2 layers of corporate structure, to Edouard's personal holdings. Edouard looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. "This is circumstantial," he said finally. "The shell company transfer records are not circumstantial," Thierry said. "The simultaneous channel construction is not circumstantial. Voss's formal statement, which he gave in exchange for a reduced consequence arrangement, is not circumstantial." He looked at his brother across the table with an expression that contained no anger and no grief, or rather, contained both so completely that they had become something else, something colder and more final. "What happens next is not a question of whether, Edouard. It is a question of how." Edouard looked at me. "Your assessment materials. You'll be required to submit them as part of any formal proceeding, which means your professional work becomes evidence in a criminal investigation, which means every assessment you've produced in the past year becomes subject to question about your objectivity and your—" "No," Thierry said. The word was quiet. Absolute. Edouard looked at him. "Her assessment materials will not be submitted to any formal proceeding," Thierry said. "The evidentiary package Felix has assembled is sufficient without them. Her professional work is hers. It does not belong to this. I looked at Thierry. He was not looking at me. He was holding his brother's gaze with the specific steadiness of a man enforcing a decision he had already made before he walked into this room. That limits the scope of what you can formally charge, Edouard said slowly. Yes, Thierry said. Because it does. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Edouard left the estate an hour later with the particular diminished quality of a man who has understood that the ground has permanently shifted beneath him and will not shift back. He had not been confronted with violence. He had been shown, precisely and completely, the full architecture of what he had done and exactly how thoroughly it had been documented. The financial investigation had already been referred to the regional regulatory authority. His access to the Maro family's operational structure, every channel, every holding, every decision-making table, was finished. What remained would unfold through legal and financial channels that required neither his presence nor Thierry's direct hand. That was the method. It had always been the method. I stood in the room after Edouard's car had left the courtyard and let the quiet settle around me. 8 weeks of pressure, and now the specific stillness of a space where something had finally concluded. I stood in it for a long moment and felt the particular quality of an ended thing, not triumphant, not relieved exactly. More like the feeling after you have correctly identified the structural fault in a building and watched the repair begin. The building was not fixed yet, but the fault had been named and the work had started, and that was its own kind of solid. Then I became aware that Thierry had not moved from his position at the end of the table. I turned. He was watching me with the quiet attention he always gave significant things, and something in his expression was working in a way I recognized as the precursor to information. You didn't use my assessments, I said. No. You had a stronger case with them. Yes. You decided not to use them. Your work is yours, he said. How it is used should be your decision, not mine, not his. He held my gaze. I should have said that to you weeks ago when I was building the counter case against his client interference. I didn't. I'm saying it now. I looked at him for a long moment. You gave up the stronger case, I said. For that. I gave up the more complete destruction, he said. The case that precedes is sufficient. Edouard's position in this family and in this industry is finished regardless. The only difference is whether your professional work was used as a weapon in the process. Something in his expression was very steady and very deliberate. I did not want it used as a weapon. You have spent enough of your career being used as a tool in other people's plans. The room was very quiet. You should have told me, I said. Before the meeting, it was my decision to make. Yes, he said. It was. A pause. I'm telling you now. Which is better than not telling me at all. Which is better than not telling me at all, he agreed. With the faintest trace of something that understood it was quoting my own standard back to me. I held his gaze across the room. He looked back at me with that expression, the one I had architecture for now. The one I had named in the corridor of this very room the night before. And I understood that we were going to spend a very long time working through the gap between his instinct to protect and my requirement to be consulted. That it would be argued about and returned to and never fully resolved because it was rooted in wounds that didn't heal cleanly. And I understood that I wanted that. The argument, the return, the work of two people whose damage ran in complementary directions trying to build something that held anyway. Call my director, I said. Tell him whatever he needs to hear to counter Edouard's interference with my clients. All of it, this time. I want it handled fully. Already done, he said. This morning. Felix reached out to 2 of your affected clients directly with the full documented context of Edouard's intermediary campaign. Your director received a formal briefing an hour ago. He paused. I was going to tell you at dinner. You were going to tell you at dinner, I said. At dinner. I looked at him for a moment. That's progress, I said. The ghost smile, fuller than it usually appeared. Almost, not quite, but almost, a real one. Camille called that evening, and this time I answered. She said what she had been trying to say since the text message, that she was sorry, that she had been a coward, that she had watched me build something careful and real and had let it happen anyway, because it was easier than being honest about what she felt. She cried at one point, which I had expected. I did not cry, which I had also expected. I don't hate you, I told her, which was true. But I need you to understand that what happened to me was real. Not just uncomfortable for the family, real. I know, she said, very quietly. We'll find our way back, I said. Just not immediately. She accepted that. It was not forgiveness, and it was not closure. And it was the beginning of the longer, slower work of sisters who had hurt each other badly enough that repair would take time. That was honest. That was the most I had to offer right now. And offering honestly felt like its own form of progress. I hung up and went to find Thierry. He was in the private study, which had become, without either of us formally deciding this, the room where we found each other. He was reading an actual book, not a document, which was the first time I had seen him do that. And he looked up when I came in, and the specific quality of the look was so ordinary and so entirely not ordinary that I stopped for a moment in the doorway. How did it go? He said. Honestly, I said. Which is the best I could manage. He held my gaze. Come here, he said. Not as a command, as an offer. In the specific phrasing of a man who had learned, over the past weeks, that offers were different from orders and that the difference mattered. I crossed the room and sat beside him, close enough that his shoulder was warm against mine, and he did not put his arm around me immediately. He let me settle, let me choose the distance, and then when I leaned into him slightly, he responded to that rather than leading it. We stayed like that for a long time without speaking, and the room held us in its old stone quiet. And outside the estate, the October coast had gone dark, and the water was a distant sound against the cliffs. And I thought, this is the thing I did not know how to want. Not the arrangement, not the protection, not the professional backing. This. Being somewhere without having to earn the right to be in it every second. Thierry, I said. Yes. I'm going to finish the Côte d'Azur assessment, I said. Under my name, as specialist of record. I'm going to submit it, and it's going to be the best work I've produced. And it's going to establish my professional standing properly. Not as a favor or a consequence of this arrangement, but because it's the right assessment done correctly. I know, he said. And after that, I said carefully, I would like to renegotiate the terms of what we are to each other. A pause. What terms would you want? Real ones, I said. Not a transaction, not a scandal containment strategy, not an arrangement with exit clauses. He was very still while I spoke. The specific stillness of a man giving something his complete attention. And I could feel it the way I felt the load of a room, entirely. Without having to touch the walls, I turned to look at him. I want the real thing, with all the difficulty that involves. I want to be consulted and argued with and trusted with the full picture, even when the full picture is inconvenient. I want to be chosen, not because I'm useful or because the timing is right or because the alternative is messier. I held his gaze. I want to be chosen because you want me specifically. That's the only term I actually care about. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from my face, deliberate, gentle, unhurried. And the tenderness of it was so specific and so unguarded that it made my throat tight in a way I did not suppress, because suppressing it had been a habit, and I was trying to stop confusing habits with protection. As then those are the terms, he said. I leaned up and kissed him, which was my answer. This one was slower than the first. Less like rupture, more like decision, the specific quality of two people choosing each other with full knowledge of what the choosing involves. His hand moved to my waist, and mine went to his chest, and we stayed in that quiet study with the old stone walls and the water outside, and the October dark pressed against the windows. And I was not afraid. For the first time in a very long time, I was not afraid of wanting something. Epilogue. 4 months later, the Côte d'Azur assessment was submitted, accepted, and published in the Regional Heritage Authority's annual review with my name on the cover page. Specialist of record. Not technical consultant. Not contributing assessor. My name. I stood in my firm's conference room and held the published copy for a moment before setting it on the table. And my director said something about what this would mean for the firm's regional profile. And I nodded in the right places and said the right professional things. And underneath all of it, I was thinking about a permit file I had noticed 4 minutes into a stack of documents, and the particular quality of a man's attention when he heard about it and understood immediately what it meant. I drove back to the estate in the late afternoon, which was something I did now without thinking about it. The estate had become the place I returned to, not the place I was permitted to stay. That distinction had taken time to settle in my body. It was settled now. Thierry was in the private study when I arrived, which was where he usually was at this hour, and he looked up when I came in with the specific expression that I had once catalogued as unreadable and now read as easily as structural surveys. I set the published assessment on the desk in front of him. He looked at it, then at me. "Specialist of record," I said. He picked it up, read the cover page with the careful attention he gave everything, set it down, and the expression on his face was not the ghost smile and not the clinical assessment. It was something open and certain and entirely unguarded. The expression of a man who was proud of someone and was no longer managing whether that showed. "Come here," he said, for the second time in 4 months, in the same quiet voice that meant the same thing. "I am offering, not directing. The distance is yours to cross." I crossed it. And he stood and I walked into him, and his arms came around me with the ease of something that had been practiced and perfected over 4 months of learning each other's specific weight and warmth. I pressed my face against his shoulder and felt him exhale. That particular exhale of a man who has been waiting for something and has stopped having to wait. We had argued twice in the 4 months since the confrontation. Properly argued. Two people with complementary wounds pressing on each other's most defended places, saying things that needed to be said, and then sitting with the aftermath until it resolved into something more honest than either of them had started with. Both times he had told me the full picture. Both times I had stayed. Neither of us had said the thing yet, the specific, irretrievable thing. And we had been circling it for weeks in the way you circle a load-bearing wall you aren't sure the structure can survive opening. Carefully, with full attention, touching the edges without committing to the alteration. I pulled back enough to look at him. "I need to tell you something," I said. "Tell me," he said, steady, present. All of him in this room, the way he was always entirely in whichever room contained me. "I love you," I said. "That's the thing. I've been carrying it for approximately 2 months, and I decided this evening, with the assessment in my hand on the way back from the firm, that the only architecture that makes sense is to say it plainly." I held his gaze. "So, I love you. That's the full picture." He looked at me for a long moment. The expression on his face was the one I had architecture for. At the one I had named in a corridor 8 weeks ago and had been watching deepen and clarify every day since. But there was something new in it now. Something that had been waiting underneath the controlled precision and the ghost smiles and the careful distances for longer, probably, than either of us had words for. "I know," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "I've known for some time." "Thierry, I love you," he said, with the specific deliberateness of a man who has spent his life understanding that words spoken aloud become permanent, and has chosen this permanence with full knowledge of its cost. "I have loved you since you stood in my study and told me you were not doing this because you were broken. I have loved you since the first permit anomaly. I have loved you in every archive room and every argument, and every moment you chose to stay when leaving would have been easier." He brought his hand to my face, that same gesture, deliberate and gentle and completely unguarded. "You are the first person I have allowed to matter in a very long time, the first I have not tried to manage into safety." He held my gaze. "I do not intend to stop." My throat was tight in a way I did not suppress. "Good," I said, which was not eloquent and was exactly right. He kissed my forehead. Then he pulled me back in and held me with the specific quality of a man who has put down something very heavy and discovered that his hands are now free for something better. As I stood in the private study of the Maro estate with the October coast outside the windows and my published assessment on his desk, and my name on the cover and my face against his shoulder, and I thought, this is what it feels like to be chosen. Not as a solution, not as a strategy, not as the sensible option, as the specific, irreplaceable person you walk across a room for. I had spent 3 years being well matched. I had spent 8 weeks being seen. And I intended to spend considerably longer being this, fully known, fully chosen, fully here. Not because I had nowhere else to go, because this was where I had decided to be. and the decision finally was entirely mine.